much for that welcome, and to PRF for inviting me to South Africa. It certainly came as a bit of a surprise, having talked to Joss a number of times in Western Australia, to get an invite to somewhere I'd never been before, despite my grandfather having been born here. So I'm going to give you a bit of a presentation around a lot of the work that we've done in Western Australia over a period of about the last 15 years, looking at how we have developed our canola industry. It is interesting to see the graph that Gerhard put up there, because in fact our industry went through a very similar process. It actually started off very slowly, collapsed because of blackleg, collapsed because of weeds. Then we had to move into a next generation of varieties. The first one we got, which actually changed the whole dynamics of our industry, was a variety called Karoo, spelled K-A-R-O-O. And it really transformed it. We went to 1 million tonnes of canola in 2 years, from about 50,000 tonnes, through one variety, getting the flowering time right, getting the disease management right, and getting the weed management right. It really did set up to say, we can do this. Unfortunately, we then have run into a series of quite severe low rainfall years. I wouldn't necessarily call them drought, but certainly extreme water stress. We've got blackleg emerging as a major problem in that period, and so it's actually been an ongoing process of development of the industry since then, and it wasn't until last year, and again this year, that we will exceed 1 million tonnes of canola production in Western Australia, off of around about 800,000 hectares. So it gives you a feel. I mean, our average yield's running about 1.2 tonnes per hectare, but with areas which have got the potential to grow over 3 tonnes per hectare. And we've certainly seen farmer yields in the order of 3 tonnes per hectare. So I'll go through some of the factors that we've been looking at, and I know some of it's got a lot of relevance to the South African situation, so hopefully you'll be able to pick up a few pointers on what to do here. There are a whole series of factors that really determine how you're going to do your canola productivity, and you're probably familiar with most of them. Water supply, nutritions, but you've got to even come back down to how much money you're making and how much you can reinvest back in the business of growing canola. It's not just a simple factor of extracting profit and expecting that the system will continue. And a lot of it is also about a set of complex interactions that occur. And as I go through, I won't necessarily talk about these things in any particular sequence. There is a sequence, but I will sort of chop and change a little bit around some of those issues because of the interactions that occur. So if you look at, sort of typical pictures of canola grown in Western Australia, I mean, you find in a really good crop, you find fantastically good canola, well grown, well potted up, but we also get various problems, everything from weeds through to poor establishment, through to compaction layers in shallow soils, and a whole series of other issues. And so trying to work out, how we're actually going to maintain yield under those circumstances. Of course, we've also got a lot of South African imports into our system. The yellow strip there is capeweed, which I've been looking around trying to find some capeweed in South Africa, and so far I haven't seen much. So we seem to have imported it all into Western Australia. If you start to think about, what are the drivers of things, I really come back to two main ones: water and nutrition. And nearly everything that we do influences in some way how water is used and how nutrition is used in the crop. And this is the stylised potential yield that you get for canola against April to October rainfall. And you can see it basically says if you're below 100 mils, you shouldn't be getting any yield. And we know that's not true. We know that sometimes we can get better yields than that. And we know sometimes even at 400 mils, we can exceed 3.5 tonnes per hectare. And it all comes back to the interactions with soil factors, with time of planting, with when the crop's actually maturing, how rainfall falls during the season. So, don't just accept that this is what you actually should get. There are a lot of drivers around this. So one of the rules and I was having this discussion with Andre yesterday, was the rules we use is you take your growing season rainfall, take a third of it off for evaporation, the water that has to move through the crop in order to grow the crop, and the other 2/3 is available for effectively producing yield. The top range that you normally get with canola is 12 kilograms per millimetre of rainfall, and that's sort of the top end of the range under normal rain-fed systems. You usually find you get less than that because there's a whole series of factors which actually pull it back below. But if you think about it, the critical period for what you want to look at is pod filling. When after flowering, you've got to have water to ensure that carbohydrates are produced, that they're moved to the grain, that the pods can keep on photosynthesizing, because pods are actually able to photosynthesize and fill grain as well. You want to be able to do that. And so this is some research results that came from a whole series of experiments. Shows that rainfall during pod fill against seed yield. You can see there's basically a relationship there, and it just about comes back through zero. If you've got 50 millimetres of stored water at the time when you have got flowering starting, grain filling starting, and you get no more rain, you should expect to be somewhere around about half a tonne per hectare. So that just sort of starts to think, and the more rain you get after that just keeps on adding to grain filling. You get to having no soil water and you get 200 millimetres of rainfall after that point. Yes, you've got really good yield potential set up as long as you have the plant numbers and the pod number potential set for those plants. So the whole factor about thinking about soil water becomes really important as much as what rainfall becomes. And that means you have to understand what your soil characteristics are. One of the things that's important is, and something we've started to do a lot of, is the concept of seasonal forecasting. How much rain might I expect in the season, so as to think about how much potential yield I might have. And we've been doing a process of trying to understand what our rainfall is. So I believe the South African Weather Service does a similar sort of thing. And you can actually start to think about where my potential yield could come from. In 2010, we did our first assessment of this process using our own methodology. We forecast that 2010 would be one of the lowest rainfall years on record, decile 1 and 2. It turned out to be the most extreme rainfall record on record, with many areas receiving less than 100 millimetres of growing season rainfall. And they really struggled to produce yields. So that's one of the tools that we're starting to use. And in fact, this is just an example of a location in Western Australia, central wheat belt, not too dissimilar, I suppose, from a location such as here, maybe a bit further east from here. And we have a map of the deciles that we would normally get. That's the long-term mean in the middle there. That's the 90% decile, 9 times out of 10, or sorry, in a year, that would be the top 10% of years, and this is the bottom 10% of years. And we track rainfall on a consistent basis. And we saw by 20th of June we were already starting to be in the lowest rainfall decile. So what we ended up with is we tracked forward what we thought the season was going to be, and we said, well, if we actually end up with decile 1 rainfall, we're down here. It turned out that the final growing season rainfall at this location was only 125 millimetres. So one of the things that we're trying to do is give farmers more advance warning of potentially risky years coming forward, because risk management is becoming a critical factor. So now I'll go into some of the components, because rainfall is one of the significant components in various phases of the system. So crop establishment and plant numbers are really, really critical to canola. We know that there are a whole series of factors, canola being a small seed, which causes problems. So everything from water and temperature relations with the germinating seed, you can get toxicity effects, depth of planting, and it's become a bit more of an issue in Western Australia as we've moved to deep blade systems for seeding canola, trying to get the right seeding boots. Predation is a really big factor for a very small seeding. We know diseases can have an impact, and we also know that there are other things that you can influence yourself, such as seed size, seed rate, and vigours of variety, which can influence your final outcome. So just a few pictures there. I don't know how clear these are, but this was an experiment looking at seeding depth. So normal seeding depth, 2 centimetres deeper, 2 centimetres deeper. Basically, you were getting no plants emerging here versus the ones which were emerging there. Here's an effect of something we see quite commonly now, which is canola planted back into full stubble retention and very poor emergence patterns because of the chemicals that can come out of the straw. And it's particularly pronounced where you have a very long, dry summer with no leaching of those chemicals out of the straw. And as soon as then you plant the canola seed and you get a rainfall event that actually leaches some of those allele chemicals onto the straw, into the emerging seedling.
It's very common in barley stubbles, and we actually do find a lot of people planting canola back after barley. The other ones are things like insects predating fields, and of course we've got herbicide residues also causing effects on canola. I'll talk a little bit more in detail about some of this stuff, such as the predation, in a minute. So things like germination temperature. Canola is pretty good at germinating under warm temperature conditions. It's very much like wild radish. And so, you know, at 25 degrees, you can see we can get quite high rates of germination. But if you drop the temperatures back to 15 degrees, you can slow the amount of canola down quite substantially. And that's important because, you know, with canola, we are trying to establish crops early. The earlier you get them into the ground, the quicker they start to flower, the better they'll pot up and grain fill during a cool, moist period. And we know that from work that's been done in Canada. Your best results, your best oil contents always come from having canola flowering pretty much on the first week in July through to the end of August, and pod filling from the middle of July through to the end of August. Germination under those dry sowing conditions, because the vast majority of canola in Western Australia is dry sown now. Very little is wet sown. So what you end up with is understanding the influence of rainfall on plant numbers. And we've done some experiments where we put different amounts of rainfall, equivalent rainfall, through irrigation onto canola. And you can see where we did on the 20th of April, we got quite good germination. Plant numbers were up around about 25 to 30 plants per square metre. But where the rainfall was less than the equivalent of about 35 millimetres, the evaporation, the high temperatures that were experienced in April, you start to get plant mortality. The loss of plants under those conditions becomes a significant issue. So you can very quickly fall below your target number and end up with only, for instance, like 10 plants per square metre, which then has some issues in terms of yield potentials, and I'll show you some graphs around that. Seed size is something you can influence quite dramatically, and our advice to people is don't sow seed less than 1.7 millimetres, and if you can and you've got the ability to grow your own seed, do try to produce seed which has got an even larger seed size. So particularly if you're thinking about difficult situations, the 2 to 2.5 millimetre seed size actually does give you a lot of resilience in your seeding systems. And just to show you the variability we get in establishment, and you probably see the same things in fields here, even when we carefully control everything we can in terms of seeding, uniform density of planting, control seed size, we get the same sorts of variability. So this was our results from our experimental program last year, and you can see we can range between as low as 30%, you know, up around the 80%. So it's quite common even in our own trials because of the environmental factors that come into play. It is quite a significant issue for you. So some examples. You'll see these here are Roundup Ready crops, but that was only because we've been doing some work on Roundup Ready hybrids to understand it. But you can see the difference in plant numbers establishment. Here's 20 plants per square metre. Here's 5 plants per square metre. And you can see that we're leaving a lot of space for evaporation to occur. We're leaving a lot of space for weeds to invade. And a loss of even one plant out of this population through disease has a significant impact on yield, whereas a loss of a single plant out of this population is going to have a lot less consequence. And you can see that, yes, we do establish a far more uniform stand here. These come back surprisingly well because you've actually got a variety which can branch out quite prolifically and compensate for the reduction in plant number. But it's not an ideal situation to be in. Looking at all the results we got from our trials last year, where we started to compare TT versus non-TT, and in the case of the non-TT, they were actually Roundup Ready, so we're looking at the yield differentials for considering the triazine drag that's in the system. You can see we got slightly different optimization functions. So with the Stingray, which is a TT variety, we were around about 30 plants per square metre, and the same with the Hyola 404 Roundup Ready. Interesting enough, the Hyola 450 TT and the other Roundup Ready plant, they were optimizing it around about 20 plants per square metre, because these are varieties which have got a very good capacity to branch out. And the other thing you'll notice there is that In fact, yield starts to fall once you go beyond that optimum plant number. And it's a function of the amount of water that's usually available to the crop later in the season. Higher plant densities often uses a lot more water. If you have a dry finish, you actually find that yield starts to fall. And it's a phenomenon that we see in other crops in Western Australia, wheat in particular, because we grow too much biomass. And if you look at the relationships that came out of some of that stuff, if you look at biomass, total dry matter, you know, even 10 plants of the Roundup Ready were producing well over 10 tonnes of biomass, but they were still only producing 1.75 tonnes of, no matter how much you put in, only 1.75 tonnes of grain yield. And the same with the stingray. Even though you had lower biomass with the stingray, you actually optimised your yield at around about that 20 to 30 plants per square metre, and you don't really push it much beyond that. So I'll now go on to one of the other drivers of the components, which is crop nutrition. And a few comments there just as general start. You know, nutrient depletion and accumulations are across to your business. And it was interesting as we were coming here, I said to my driver that, oh, wow, look at all those fields and all the tiger stripes in them. And to us, tiger stripes mean that you're actually doing nutrient depletion. You're actually harvesting nutrients off some parts of the paddock, putting it somewhere else, and you're reducing your optimum performance in that area in between. And I know Andrews will probably say, what? But it's very characteristic for the similar sorts of soil types in Western Australia. We've been observing this for a long time now, that as you move into very heavy cropping programs, you start to deplete nutrients, particularly trace elements, and we see classic tiger strike symptoms across many fields in Western Australia because we've got very old soils, very low nutrient status, and for trace elements, for instance, haven't been replenished on a regular basis. People put them on once 20 years ago thinking, oh, I don't need to put any more trace elements on. So they're sorts of things that start to have an impact. The other components that we're really interested in is this things like leaching of nitrate, removal of nutrients and soil acidification. Western Australia now has some of the most acid soils in the world, and it's costing us a lot of dollars to fix up that acidification. With soil acidity, start early. Don't wait till you're in a crisis situation before you start applying lime. You know, if you're down around about pH 5, you should be starting to seriously think what your liming program should look like, particularly if you have some acid subsoils. And trying to understand, you know, these the complex interactions that occur in nutrition and how that relates back to plant growth is something that is really, really important. So simple things like nitrogen-rich plants use more water. Two reasons. One is they've often got more leaf area. The other reason is they have a darker leaf. A darker leaf absorbs more heat. Higher temperatures means more water flows through the plant. So you can actually deplete water far more quickly in a nitrogen-rich crop. And so this was some results taken from a trial that we're conducting in 2014 at Merredin, which is low rainfall. Same plant establishment. This one had about 60 kilograms of nitrogen at seeding. This one only had 20 kilograms of nitrogen at seeding. Which one will have the higher yield will be determined very much by how much rainfall we get after that. But current prospects are very little rain expected for the next 4 to 6 weeks. So it'll be interesting to see which one comes out with the higher yield, but I'd be betting that that one will probably have higher yields because this one's already getting to the point where most of the water's been depleted out of the soil. So there's a few things that we often talk about when we think nutrition, and this is the experience of a lot of work done by the Department of Agriculture and senior scientists over many years. It's a little bit of a combination of diagnostics. It's a bit of a combination of thinking about the strategies and tactics you can employ. So understanding your starting point, available nitrate, P, K, trace elements, you know, what is most limiting, and more importantly, what do you have for free? Because if you've already built up a huge phosphate bank in the system, maybe you don't need to be going and putting a lot of P into the system. If you have deep nitrate available, we do in Western Australia in our dryland environments, we actually have a lot of deep nitrate available. Can we access it? Can we use that to boost grain yield and not apply fertiliser nitrogen? Things like, you know, what do you want to achieve? Is it yield or quality or your highest gross margin? because they're not necessarily synonymous. Having the highest yield doesn't necessarily give you the highest gross margin. So they're just things that you've got to think about when you fertilise for different outcomes. Timing is obviously critical, and I'll show you some results on that. Your costs of different forms of nutrient. What's the cheapest nitrogen source to you? What are the impacts of that nitrogen source? In Western Australia, urea is the cheapest source of nitrogen, but obviously, it's got different ways of being applied. It does come with some costs. Just simply reducing wastage has a big impact. Most of our growers now have got GPS systems. They're all going to try and find out ways to reduce the wastage of fertiliser, pesticides, fuel in the system, and usually it's about 8 to 9% savings you can be made. And thinking about your rotations, if you start to get into rotations which demand high levels of fertiliser inputs into the system, you always run the risk that in years where yields are low or prices are low, you start to significantly reduce your profit margins. And there are other tools available. So the one that we're using a lot of in Western Australia is liming, because as lime penetrates into the subsoil, reduces the acidity, gets rid of aluminium, which is toxic to canola roots, we actually find we can get quite a substantial increase in yield, and we also make more P and more molybdenum available at the same time. So just a quick one on timing of application. Experiments we did in a medium rainfall zone, 350 to 450 annual rainfall, so this is about a 275 growing season rainfall. You can see here that with different weeks after sowing, 0, 3, 6, 9 and 12, that putting all your nitrogen on at seeding was actually giving you the highest yields. Waiting till 12 weeks, obviously, was way too late for yield performance. So the majority of Western Australian growers in low rainfall environments are moving to put more nitrogen on where there's no leaching occurring before seeding. They use a combination of ammonium sulfate and urea plus often DAP or MAP, depending upon the price of the products. If you go to a high rainfall leaching situation, it looks somewhat different. So here's where you've got probably 400 growing season rainfall. You get very big intense rainfall events that move the nitrogen out of the system, and you can see that in fact it's the 6 weeks after seeding which starts to 9 and 6 weeks which start to give you the better yield responses. And putting all your nitrogen on up front, you don't gain much because you pretty much lose it all through leaching. So one of the difficulties is knowing what type of rainfall year you're going to have, which is one of the reasons why we're moving very much to seasonal forecasting. We did experiments last year where we looked at different rates of nitrogen applied, 25 kilos versus 50 kilos, looked at the grain yields, and also did some split work at the 50 kilo rate to see what would go on. The blue lines are the yields, very flat response surface in both situations. The oil level tends to fall the later you delay your nitrogen application. So by the time of 12 weeks, you can actually lose oil. What's interesting is when you start to look at all these combinations, you can find up to 8 weeks, your gross margins don't change very much. And in the same situation where you've got split applications, in a site where you've got very little responsiveness to nitrogen, you can put a lot of nitrogen on and actually get no significant increase in your profit. So you've got to be really careful with nitrogen and I'll explain why in a second. We've been looking at paddocks to see what's going on with farmers. So we have a very big program of 200 fields around Western Australia that we survey on an annual basis, and we've been getting an assessment of what's happening. So if you look at this is the input of nutrients that have been going into those paddocks, 32 kilos of N, 44, 19, sulfur, phosphorus 12, 10, 5, potassium, virtually no potassium. Our growers literally do not put potassium on for canola, but we are putting on some reasonable quantities of trace elements. You might sit there and say, well, why the difference in the amounts that are going on 2012, 2013? Well, 2012, we had a very, very big crop in 2011. Growers were cashed up. They spent a lot of money on nitrogen. 2012 turned out to be one of the driest finishes we'd ever experienced, and yields crashed big time. So cash flow was really poor. So farmers said, right, less nitrogen going on in 2013. So that's what they did. They just cut back the amounts of fertiliser N that went into the system in that year. You see they cut back sulphur, they cut back phosphorus. So they actually fertilised a lot less as a consequence of coming out of a very, very poor finish in 2012. If you go and look at the nutrient balance after harvest, the amounts going in versus the amounts coming out, nitrogen's pretty much in balance. Sulphur, actually accumulating. Phosphorus, we're accumulating. Potassium, we're extracting potassium out of our soils because we're not putting any in. So we're in a net negative situation. And trace elements, we're in a slightly positive situation. 2013 started off good, went dry, but then we had the best finish we've had in probably 50 years, and yields went through the roof. And so we actually ended up putting less nitrogen up front and extracting more nitrogen out the other end. We were just fortunate that because of the dry finish that we had in 2012, a lot of the nitrogen that went on in 2012 accumulated in the subsoil, and the plants were able to extract it. And we actually gave advice out to growers based upon our soil surveys to say you can have anywhere up to 40 kilos of nitrogen sitting in your subsoil. You don't necessarily have to go and fertilise to a large extent to get optimum yields this year. And growers took that advice and cut back on the amount of nitrogen they spent, particularly given their poor cash flow situation. The other component that goes with nitrogen obviously is rotation benefits, particularly with legumes. And we've done quite a lot of experiments looking at rotations, and this is where we've grown canola after each of the different crops in a 6-year rotation. And you can see that there are benefits from disease management. There are some costs associated with growing canola after, you know, it's a crop like barley. But the 2, 3 which really stand out are fallow, field peas and green manures, where you're actually getting disease management, weed control, and a very big boost of nitrogen into the system. So, you know, there's a net benefit there, which is at least against wheat, which is another 150 kilos, and against crops like barley, 300 plus kilos per hectare, which, you know, is a reasonably cost-effective form of nitrogen to put in, as long as you've got a market for your field peas or your lupins, or in the case of green manure, you can actually put sheep onto that and get a really good return from the sheep. One of the things that we've seen a lot of is why do different crops such as canola respond on some seemingly quite good soil types, and we don't understand why. So here, for instance, we've got a soil which is very high in P. pH doesn't look too bad at 5. With no fertiliser applied, it only produced 1.9 tonnes of biomass, despite all this P being supposedly being available. Put 12 kilos of P on it, it went to 6.7. At 24 kilos of P, we're 11.3 tonnes per hectare. And the yields were proportional to exactly that. So why, with all of this P, were we still getting a response to phosphorus? And the response was, and what we conjectured is that maybe it was a pH effect. So there were some experiments done looking at liming to see what would occur. And you can see the effects there quite dramatically. Nil lime, stunted canola plants, very poor establishment. Put lime on, wow, we suddenly started finding canola plants that would grow. But if we incorporated that lime, we got an even bigger response. So it's telling us straight away that this is something to do with a lime response. And if you look at the soil analysis, that's exactly the message you get. Huge levels of phosphorus sitting in the surface soil, at very, very high levels. Even quite good levels as you go down through the profile. You looked at the pHs, 4.4 in the surface, 4.5 with no lime, goes to 5.2 with lime, and 5.3. Yes, we've definitely got an acid surface soil. Canola hates acid surface soils, but more importantly, look at the aluminium concentrations here. We had very toxic levels of aluminium without the lime, and very low, much more amenable levels of aluminium with the lime. So it's telling us straight away that the real driver of this was actually aluminium toxicity, and canola is very susceptible to aluminium toxicity. And it just demonstrates that, you know, you've got to go through a fairly careful process of diagnosis, and I'm sure there are other situations that we have these problems. the majority of soils in Western Australia have deep subsoil acidity rather than surface acidity. So this was an exception. But we know that the consequence of having deep acidity is that the roots can't grow into where the water is. So if you're after stored water and you can only get roots down to 30 centimetres and there's water below 30 centimetres, canola will not take it up because it just won't grow into soils which are acid and aluminium, high in aluminium. So it really starts to say, spend a lot more time investigating your soils, actually doing analysis at depth to see what's going on. I'll now move on to sort of more the crop protection side of the business and thinking about some of the things that can affect it. Animals are surprisingly good at reducing canola yield, and there's a whole range of predators. We have a problem with snails, slugs, mice. They're ones we see at crop establishment quite commonly, along with lucerne flea, red-legged earth mites, aphids. Increasingly, we're seeing an increase in nematodes. False wireworm is a really big problem for us. And then, of course, we've got a whole range of animals that affect the plant later on. Diamondback moth, budworm, and cabbage aphids are in particular. We don't just see, reduced plant numbers. We get reduced crop growth. Viruses are becoming a problem. And obviously, having less pod numbers after flowering is a really big issue. And just an example, conical snails. These are small, tiny snails that have been largely found in the metropolitan areas, towns, have now moved out onto farms. And we think the reason is that, mum and dad take home a pot plant from the nursery and they move the snail out onto their farm, and within a couple of years the snail starts to move out into the fields. And they particularly like canola. And of course, you have the same problem here as what we have. They're a contaminant at grain harvest, and it's very, very difficult to get them out of the system. So we do experiments trying to understand, can we actually have an effect? Conical snails do reduce plant numbers. So here's days after treatment of putting down copper silicate, which is supposed to reduce the effect of snails versus baits, and you can see the difference in the number of plants surviving 20 days after treatment. One's at 30 to 35, and the other one's down as low as 15 to 17. So it can have they can have a pretty dramatic effect on your plant numbers. There are a lot of other insects in rotations in canola, and we've been studying which ones are common. So this is where we planted canola back after different crops. So canola was year 2, barley, canola, lupins, pasture and wheat. And you can see the huge spike that you get with the number of insects, particularly blue oat mite, bolostium mite and red-legged earth mite after a pasture phase. That does have an effect. This is the feeding damage associated with those insects. And you can see that in the pasture, the feeding damage is greater than what it is with the other crops. So pasture, is one of the phases you've got to think about from an insect point of view. Of course, we also get more predators, so we get more ants and spiders in there. But we also get a few other interesting creatures, vegetable weevil and brown earwigs. And these can actually have quite a serious effect on canola plants if they build up to large numbers. False wire worm, rather than false wire control. False wire worm is an insect which likes living in stubble, and we know that if you can reduce the level of stubble on the surface, you can actually take away the site where false wireworm are harboured. And so simple things like raking can have a dramatic effect on the number of canola plants you get. So you rake the stubble prior to planting. Obviously it knocks the stubble right down, but you can see the difference in the number of plants per square metre in the establishment. You're down here virtually at 0 with no raking, and you're still at 45 with raking. So, that's a cultural treatment that is being adopted more and more by growers, and they're doing it both in the canola phase, coming out of canola, going back into wheat, and coming out of wheat, going back in, or barley, going back into canola. Aphids are a really important pest in Western Australia, cabbage aphids in particular, but also green peach aphid because it spreads viruses, and turnip aphids. So, we did a lot of work on cabbage aphids trying to understand, when do you spray, when don't you spray? And basically the conclusion from the early experiments is, when we were growing the old varieties like Karoo and long season varieties like Pinnacle, you could have 5 to 10% of flower heads infested, and you really wouldn't get much response to taking those aphids out. As we've moved into higher yielding potential crops, and we're starting to see more viruses around in the system, we start to say, well, once you're getting to 20% of plants infested at the flower head stage, it starts to become economic to remove those aphids out of the system. So, you know, you've got to do a bit of work to go through and check fields, make sure that, you know, you don't just have your aphids in one patch, because sometimes that's what they do. They just sit on the outside, and a barrier spray can be effective at actually controlling further influx into the crop. There are quite a few diseases of canola. I think you've got, from what my comments this morning, I think you probably have most of them here in South Africa. Blackleg is obviously the number one enemy, but sclerotinia stem rot is emerging in Western Australia as being a really big problem, particularly in the areas north of Perth rather than the south and central. We've started to see a few new diseases. Downy mildew came in a couple of years ago. White leaf spots appeared on a number of different occasions. Eltonaria is definitely starting to appear. Powdery mildew is not too bad. Clubroot came as a bit of a surprise to us because, you know, clubroot is normally associated with horticultural area, and yet we're finding it in our canola growing regions. So it suggests that, you know, there is sufficient inoculum in the air to allow clubroot to establish. And the one that we've seen a bit of, and which Eastern Australia is having this year, is beet western yellows virus. So look, I won't go a lot into blackleg. I mean, there are, and I believe you already used this, the blackleg management guide fact sheet out of GRDC, which, you know, the Department of Agriculture and many other parts of Australia, we make contributions to. It's one of the most useful pieces of information you can have with regard to how to manage this disease, and importantly, it gives you the ratings of tolerance and the different genes that are associated with each of the varieties. So from a rotation purpose, you can actually think about where you want to, which varieties to put in the system. And it's free. So, I mean, you know, this is the beauty of our system, is we actually do try to provide a lot of free information. We have a model called the blackleg spherical model, which allows us to predict when the spores are going to be released, which means growers actually have more confidence in using different planting times. And it allows them to adjust their varieties to a certain extent, or actually go and put fungicides on at the right time. So we're seeing an increasing amount of fungicide being put down before seeding with the fertiliser, and growers are far more prepared to go out now and spray with a fungicide, because they have the information coming out of the model which tells them when the spores are being released and when's the best time to actually do a preventative spray. Sclerotinia, our main driver, we think, is increased canola plantings and the shortened rotations. We know that on the west coast of Western Australia, right on the coastal area, this gets frequent rain, and that's actually also contributing. As we go further east into the lower rainfall areas, sclerotinia diminishes quite dramatically, and we do often find that we've got this synchronisation of flowering with spore release, so it's absolutely going on at the right time. How to deal with it? Well, you know, long rotations. It's difficult. Some people, from an economic point of view, down to 1 in 3. We still suggest 1 in 4 as the optimum rotation sequence, so canola only once every 4 years. Trying to avoid sowing close to last year's infected crops becoming increasingly difficult, because by the time we end up with 1 million hectares of canola in Western Australia, we're actually going to have canola crops sitting next to canola crops quite regularly. You know, I'm going to plan to plant canola on my place next year, and yet my neighbour's sowing canola all around me. So I'm actually going to have a difficult proposition growing canola. Trying to keep my plant densities high, and I've already talked about some of that. Fungicides, you know, we do have fungicides now, whereas in the past we never did. And of course you can get information, and you can see the effect of what a fungicide at 50% bloom can do. It can actually keep a lot of plants from being infected with the disease. The emerging diseases, downy mildew suddenly appeared out of nowhere and suddenly disappeared out of nowhere. It's been quite fascinating watching it. But white leaf spot is one that is of significant concern for us, because for many years we knew it was there, and suddenly it's just started to blow up. And I believe white leaf spot's starting to become a bit of a problem here as well. We do know that with white leaf spot there's a lot of genetic diversity, and that there is also that varieties differ. You can have very resistant varieties down to very susceptible varieties. And the same with another disease I'll talk about in a minute. We don't necessarily have a program to assess the levels of resistance of canola varieties to white leaf spot. This is a virus called beet western yellows virus. It has many similarities when the plants are infected to phosphate or nitrogen deficiency, and can often be mistaken for it. It's it's possible to find areas, and I saw some at Swellendam yesterday or the day before, I think it was, where you have whole patches of crops infected. It's driven by a combination of events where you have a reasonably good amount of summer rain to allow the over-summering of brassica weeds in particular, which harbour the virus. Aphid numbers can build up quickly in autumn. They move off of the reservoir, which is the weeds, into the crop, and very quickly you've got an infection in your crop. And then it seems to be you need a couple of other triggers. Another stress coming in, so cold seems to have been the stress at Swellendam, but you also need to have susceptible varieties. And we know that with beet western yellow virus, there is a range of varietal responses from highly susceptible to very resistant. So again, we don't necessarily know what the level of reaction of varieties are. It's not a regular testing program. So the case with a variety called zircon this year was probably a function of all those things coming together in an interaction. Aphids at the right time, a reservoir, because we could find some plants which had beet western yellow virus on amongst the weeds, having a variety and having a stress. Just one of those classic interactions that we sometimes see. And as you can see there, it says yield losses up to 46%. In the plots, the field that we looked at, Swellendam, I would have said it was closer to about 70% in the areas that were heavily infected. They were really severely affected plants and were never going to recover their yield. And just to show you an example of this, this is some work we did a few years ago, where we actually looked at the importance of rainfall in autumn for the build-up of aphids and when the aphids were first recorded on the crop, because these were and aphids were taking beet western yellows virus into the crop. And you can see at Badgingarra, 130 millimetres of autumn rainfall. We had aphids move in on the 10th of June, and we ended up with 80% of plants infected with beet western yellows virus. At Mount Barker, 40 mils of rain, aphids didn't move in until very late, and we had about 20% of plants infected. So it's really important to realise that over-summering characteristic contributes. So if you have a long, dry summer where all of your reservoir dies, you've actually got a very low risk of having beet western yellows virus. Contrary to that, if you have a summer which is unusually wet, radish grows rather prolifically, aphids can carry through, especially the green peach aphids, then you will have a much higher risk of getting the disease. And it is here in South Africa, right? This is not an import. This is a virus that's widespread all around the world, and it's basically in any brassica species. You just got to have the right conditions to let it appear in your crops. I won't talk too much weeds because Chris has got a really good presentation on that, but there are some things that we do take into consideration in weeds. TT canola, its lower vigour makes for reduced competition. I mean, part of the reason why we try to keep plant numbers up with TTs is because of that vigour. I know you grow IT Clearfield varieties here, so you've got the higher vigour, and I have seen it do a really good job at keeping weeds suppressed. One of the things about triazines with the TT we know is that it needs moist soil to really make them work to their optimum performance. So the two things is the uniformity of incorporation and the amount of rain. So if you have a reduced disturbance seeding system like we do with knife points and you're throwing the soil away, we often find that in the furrows there is no herbicide, and so you actually get poor weed control. And we also know that we sometimes plant our crops and then we go for 3 weeks with no subsequent rainfall, and we wonder why ryegrass keeps growing through that and why wild radish comes through that. So this effect of triazines in being able to manage weeds early is really very dependent upon the amount of soil rainfall you get, soil water you got, and how much rainfall you get. IMI herbicides are used in WA, but the cross resistance issues of from other ALS herbicides like Glean, Logran, mean that we've pretty much gone away from using IMI tolerant varieties, except for the hybrids. Because of their yield potential over TTs, quite a few people still stick with the hybrids. Trifluralin has been a mainstay of canola production systems, but its effectiveness due to resistance is starting to decline. And people say, well, you know, I used to get away with 1.5 litres, I'm now up to 2 litres, and I'm increasingly putting on 2.5 litres per hectare, and still not getting good ryegrass management. The grass selective herbicides, which have been always used widely, are pretty much gone. A few people still get usefulness out of clethodim, but for most of the other grass selective herbicides, the FOPs and DIM family, there's not a lot of usefulness left. We have obviously gone to Roundup Ready canola in Western Australia, and about 30% of the production is Roundup Ready. The 65% of it is TT, and about 5% is conventional and IT. Roundup Ready has been particularly useful for ryegrass and wild radish, and Chris will talk a lot more about this, but we have started to find it resistance emerging in Western Australia, and in some quite appreciable areas. And the other thing that's actually starting to impact upon weed management is, as we've had these lower rainfall years, growers are starting to ask the question and actually doing it themselves. They're moving their canola out onto wider rows. And the consequence of that is we are seeing more weeds come into the system, because the wider rows leave more open space, and they also have the problem of, with lower rainfall, the TT is not working so well. So it's a bit of a challenge with these things to actually make canola fit in all of our farming systems. Variety choice is an area which is, you know, people talk a lot about. In Western Australia and Australia in general now, we have way too much variety choice, in my opinion. It's very, very hard to know necessarily that you are going to make a good variety choice. But there are a few things that you can consider. You know, yield trials generally are a good indicator of relative performance of varieties if they're done in the right locations with good controls. But you need to start to think about what you're actually trying to achieve. You know, are you after disease tolerances and rotation? Because that can be really, really critical in terms of your risk management. You know, flowering time for the expected season. I mean, one of the things that's impressed me this year, looking at some of the South African canola, is the fact that, you know, back towards Swellendam, it was obviously planted early, it flowered early, and it's pod filled during a cool, wet conditions, and it's absolutely maxed out its yield potentials, in my view. So you probably won't get much better than that for this type of season. The challenge is when you get a dry season. Starts late, don't get a lot of early rain, where do you go to? How do you manage those sorts of systems? The thing that we increasingly try to think about is the potting ability of the plants, because the very good evidence that yield is directly proportional to pod number. Biomass is also related, but podding is far more important. So you can have a low biomass plant with a high pod numbers and get very, very good yields out of it. Vice versa, you can have a plant with lots and lots of leaf and biomass, not produce a lot of pods and actually not make a lot of yield out of it. So you got to, when you're looking at varieties, just think about that podding ability and how the variety sets it up. But you can also look at from the point of view of what leaf growth does. Early leaf spreading varieties minimise water loss. So if you are trying to minimise the evaporation from the soil surface, leaves are pretty good at doing that. And if you're actually trying to increase plant density, then going for those ones which have more uplight leaves can be really, really useful to capture sun. And you saw the plots with the Roundup Ready canola there, and the fact that even at 5 plants per square metre, they were showing some pretty good potting ability. Those plants which have an ability to aggressively branch are the ones that are desired if you end up with a low plant number situation and you don't have the ability to recover it. going for ones with high branching is a very useful trait to have. So here's just some experiments that came from CSIRO. They looked at maturity type and different seasons, so a wet season versus a dry season. So this one started off good, had good finishing rains, and you can see the early maturity types were at a slight disadvantage, and the late, mid and late were actually producing much higher yields. But in 2010, remember back, this was one of the driest years we had on record. You can see that the early ones had the advantage because they could get through, pot up and fill grain before the real drought stress came in. It depends upon location as well. Another component which has come up in terms of productivity for us has been harvest technology. Western Australian growers have swung away from swathing their grain, their canola crops, to virtually direct heading everything, direct harvesting everything. And the reasons why became pretty obvious, you know, when you start talking to growers. Why are you doing it? Oh, well, I tried it for the first time on 15 hectares. My yield was up 0.4 of a tonne and my oil was higher. And because they get paid for an oil bonus, geez, that was dollars in the bank for doing nothing. And so, you know, then they started having a look at it, you know, Tanami, which is an early season variety, Boomer, a slightly longer season, 2.5 tonnes, 3 tonnes from direct harvesting in 2007. And you can see there the district average, 2.7 versus 1.8. There's 0.9 of a tonne per hectare better from direct harvested versus swathing. And so growers very quickly have actually realised that we're better off going for a direct harvesting approach. Now, the thing that you have to look for are varieties with even maturity and drying and with low pod shattering. And, you know, they're the things that are really critical to making sure that that system works very well. The other thing that was important about it, if you are going to be in a swathing situation, you really do have to have uniform plant numbers in order to be able to put the swaths down into standing crop and stop it from blowing away. And we've seen quite a few problems in Western Australia, and the one you might have heard about is the GM canola situation, where swath GM canola blew onto a organic farmer's property, and there's been a court case running. So you can see what happens when you have a low yielding canola that's swathed with no ability to hold it in amongst the low plant stand. It can blow away quite quickly. And so that's why another reason why people have started to think about direct harvesting. Just a few other comments before I finish off. There are some tools for diagnosing constraints in canola. The one that the Department of Agriculture and GRDC have been working on for the last 5 years is called MyCrop. It's free to you. You can download it onto your iPhone. You can download it onto your computer at home. And it gives you a lot of information. It's got a very extensive image library, fact sheets, and at the moment there's 150 constraints, and we're still working on putting more on. And you don't need phone coverage. Once you've downloaded it onto your system, it holds all the information there for you. And you can pretty much just take your iPhone or appropriate phone out into the field, and you can check out by a process of elimination and come up with some pretty logical answers to what your problems might be. Now, it doesn't absolutely tell you what you've got. Sometimes you will find you might end up with 2 or 3 constraints or problems that look the same, and you may still have to consult with other people. But it's a very, very good starting point for looking at constraints in canola. And I'll pretty much finish off by thinking about, well, you know, at the end of the day, you're growing canola. Yes, you're trying to increase production, but you're actually trying to make more dollars to take home. And we see this quite regularly. 2 different farmers, one who spends a lot of money, one who doesn't spend much money. Both of them take home the same final profit. One, in my view, is at much higher risk of, when things go wrong, of losing equity, and the other one who's much more stable. And how you get to be Farm A and Farm B is very much up to all of the choices you make in the system and how you use those choices in the system. So the different enterprises, canola versus pasture versus other components. And so, you know, we talk more about the profit gap now with businesses in trying to get a better assessment of what goes on. And you can think about this and, you know, the ways of increasing profit and optimizing profit is actually got a relationship to productivity. So one of the ways of increasing Profit is yield, productivity. But you've also got to take into mind that you've got other components to this, and I haven't talked about some of these. But a simple process that we use is to think about, well, you know, how does your rate of nitrogen influence your yield performance? Unfortunately, the green line hasn't come out very well there. But, you know, this is about using a combination of diagnostics. How much organic carbon do I have in the soil? 0.5, 1, or 1.5. So green is the 0.5 line, blue is the 1, and red is the 1.5. And the amount of organic carbon determines very much the amount of free nitrogen you'll have available to grow that crop. Once you get above 1% organic carbon, as long as you're not pushing your yields too high, you actually find you often don't get a very big production response or economic response to applying more nitrogen if you're in an average rainfall situation. And we've done a lot of work on this to show that many growers can optimize their productivity at around about 20 kilos of N per hectare if you've got an organic carbon level of 1%, which is pretty typical for a lot of soils in Western Australia. And certainly once you get above the 1.5 or to the 1.5% level, putting more nitrogen on often costs you money. But you can see the very, very big response surface you get if you're down at low organic carbon levels. You can still be making yield and still be making profit when you're putting on much higher rates of nitrogen. Now that model is called SYN, Select Your Nitrogen, and it's one that we've been using quite a lot to inform growers about what appropriate levels of nitrogen they need in different years. And I'll finish off by just saying thank you to a lot of people in the Department of Agriculture. These are people who are currently in the department who do work on canola across a whole range of different topics. And I should say that some of those slides came from ex-DAFWA staff who've undertaken canola research in the last 30 years. Many have retired or gone to other jobs. So the database we have on how to grow canola in Western Australia is quite extensive. And we try to use it and make it available through things like our web. And you can visit our website there to download or to read quite a lot of information about canola productivity. Thank you.